The Churches of Christ present Speaking the Truth in Love, a program bringing you life's answers from the Word of God.
I'm James Johnston, the minister of Nettleton Church of Christ in Jonesboro, Arkansas. Our program is brought to you by the area churches which are listed at the end of the program. To help you grow in your relationship with God, we're offering free resources on both our Facebook page and our website. We are also offering an online Bible course at seekthetruth.worldbibleschool.org. Our speaker today is Seth Purnell, the minister of the Church of Christ in Portia, Arkansas.
There are a lot of great buildings in our world today. If you take a look around the world and see some of the great achievements that mankind has made in the spaces of architecture and the spaces of being able to build things, we see that we've been able to accomplish some pretty amazing things. If you even go back in the Bible to the book of Genesis, very early on in the history of mankind, what did they do? They joined together and they decided, we're going to create a tower that reaches into the heavens, which later is known as the Tower of Babel. Because when at this point, God wanted the people to spread out across the earth, but they made this decision in order to build this tower. And this tower was not according to his will, so he confused the language of all the people that were there. And with this confusion, they were not able to work, and so they scattered across, the earth. But they set their mind to build, this tower. And even today, we see a lot of great buildings around the world, because we know when something is constructed, when someone puts their mind to build something, they first have to put in their mind, what is the purpose of this building? What is it going to do? How is it going to look? All these decisions need to be made before, that building starts, so that it can be done in the right way, so that it can be done, efficiently. If you look around the world, there's things such as, the Eiffel Tower, such as, the Roman Colosseum, the St. Louis Arch, the Statue of Liberty. You can take a look at these many different things that have been built, some as monuments, some as, other structures that mankind has made, and they are pretty impressive. But if you go back a little bit further, after, the Tower of Babel in the book of Genesis, and go to the book of Exodus, the second book, in the Bible, we see that there is a number of buildings that were constructed in order to facilitate, worship, to house the presence of God among, the people. if you remember in the history of Israel, in the book of Exodus, they go to the land of Egypt, at the end of the book of Genesis. And there they become, slaves of Egypt, where the Egyptians, they treat them, pretty poorly. They treat them with, hard labor. And they go through a really rough time to where they cry out to God for deliverance. They cry out to Him to save them from this plight that they have. And so that is what God does. He raises up a deliverer by the name of Moses. Moses, who grew up in Egypt, he knew his way around Egypt because he had grown up in the house of Pharaoh. But he is called by God through the scene, if you remember, of the burning bush, in which he, has this conversation with God. God tells him, you are the one that is going to go and deliver Israel. And so, even though he had some objections at first, he agrees, and he does that, along with his brother, Aaron. And so, as through the power of God, they are delivered from Egypt, and they start out on that journey to the Promised Land. But doing on this journey, they have got to figure out how to worship God, how to have the presence of God there with them while they're traveling. And so to do this, they built what is called the tabernacle, which is a tent that was built by the specifications of God. And this was to house the presence of God. The priests were to kind of manage it, and it was something that was very very important. A person did not just do anything or everything, around the temple. But it was a holy place. It was something that was there for the people to see, the presence of God, among them. In the book of Exodus, in chapter 25, and verses 8 through 9, this is what God told them to do. It says, "And let them make me a sanctuary, that I may dwell in their midst, exactly as I show you concerning the pattern of the tabernacle and of all of its furniture, so you shall make it." And we could go into the different items that were placed in the tabernacle. One of the things that was to be put there was the Ark of the Covenant. And so it was, there's many different things that had different functions, for this tabernacle. But it was something that the people could see and be reminded, that God, was with them. You remember, as they were leaving Egypt, God led them with a pillar of cloud by day, a pillar of fire, by night. They could see that and be reminded, that God, was with them. But the tabernacle was served, a different function. And it was something that they used on their journeys. And as they were traveling, from Egypt, to the Promised Land, which took a little longer than they probably thought at first. But it was there, and it served, like I said, that reason. But if you fast forward to the book of Kings, in 1 Kings chapter 6, in verse 12, we see that there is a commissioning of another building, a one much more permanent and much grander than the tabernacle was. This would be referred to as the temple. If you remember the story of David, a mighty man who was anointed king of Israel when he was not very old. The prophet Samuel came to visit his family, and he was eventually anointed king. He would gain victory over the giant Goliath, through just a sling and a stone, because he put his trust in God over the weapons of war that they had. David would go on to become, king and do even mightier things after that. He would be a leader of the people, a very faithful leader, even though he had his times of mistakes. He had his times in which he would, put off, the instruction of God. But in the end, he always came back to God. He was a very, very faithful leader for the people. But he had this, a realization. He said, how can I dwell in these good houses that I have made, while God dwells in a tent, while the place to honor God is a temporary structure or a tent. And so he says, I'm going to build God a temple. I'm going to build a temple that can house his glory. And so he set his mind to do this. But God came to him and said, you are not the one to build this temple, but this will be the task of your son. And so, as you know, the son of David, Solomon, he would be given the task of building, this temple, constructing, this temple, and putting it together. Solomon, who's known for his wisdom, he is known for his ability in order to approach things in a wise manner. He was given that, by God. God gave him a divine measure of wisdom because that's what he asked for. And so he's given this, and he becomes one of the most prosperous kings that Israel will ever see. As far as their economic success, as far as the wealth that they had, throughout their time, there's nothing to compare to Solomon. He had that in over everything. But he would set his mind to build this temple, and this would be the most extravagant, the most impressive structure in the history of the Israelites. The amount of gold, the amount of precious materials that would go into this, would be unlike any other. This would be something that would be more than anything that was before in Israel's history, and more than anything, after. In 1 Kings chapter 6 and verse 12, this is what the writer records. He says, "For this temple you are building, if you follow my decrees, observe my laws, and keep all my commands, and obey them, I will fulfill you through the promise I gave to David your father, and I will live among the Israelites, and will not abandon my people Israel." That was his promise, that he gave to them, concerning, this building. And so and just like the tabernacle, it was something that was holy. It was a place where the presence of God physically dwelt, with them. And it was stood as a reminder that God, was with, the people. And this, even though it would not, last, for an eternity, but it was there at that time, for them. Later on, once the temple is, destroyed and it is rebuilt in a much, much simpler fashion, those who remember the temple of Solomon, would weep, and cry, because they had remembered just how great, this temple was. It's something, like I said, beyond, what they could imagine. We can only imagine what this temple looked like. We can only kind of form an image in our mind. But it must have been something really impressive, really spectacular. To make somebody weep and cry over the fact that it did not live up to its glory. But to have this reminder, that God is indeed with us. That's something that we need from time to time, that we need as we go throughout our life. We need those reminders. If you're like me, sometimes you don't really, you may not look to God at all times. Maybe when you get in trouble, or maybe when you're going through a hard time, you look to God, and you look to Him for His deliverance. And maybe in the good times, we may not do it as much, but we need those reminders at all times, that God is with us. We need that reminders from our brothers and sisters in Christ. We need those reminders from His Word, that we should be invested in, that we should be involved in at all times. We need those reminders from a lot of different places. And so if we surround ourselves with those reminders, it will do good for us. It will strengthen our faith. It will allow us to do well on this earth, because we won't be distracted. We won't be put off on another route. But we need those reminders, just as the temple was a reminder to the people of Israel, and we need those reminders around us as well. But if you fast forward to the book of Corinthians, into the life of a man by the name of Paul. Paul, he was an evangelist, he was an apostle, he was somebody who spent he dedicated his life to the spreading of the gospel. Even before his life, he did whatever he could to stamp out Christianity. Once he had a conversation in Acts chapter 9 with Jesus himself, he came to realize that the very thing that he was fighting against was what he should have been doing all along. And so he makes that change, he makes that correction to his course, and he becomes like the most frequent author throughout the Bible. But In 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 16, he has an interesting statement where he talks about us and how we approach God and our relationship to him. In verse 16 it says, "What agreement has the temple of God with idols? For we are the temple of the living God, as God has said, I will live in them and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people." What does, Paul say here in 2 Corinthians? He says, there is no connection with God and idols, but we are the temple of the living God. Just as, the temple as this physical structure that was created, for Israel to see, the physical presence of God, to worship Him, to have that sense of glory among them. Just as he had that in a physical sense, Paul makes a statement. He says, you and me are the temple of the living God. That's something that is special, when you think about it. When you think about the significance of that we are a temple. You may not think that you are a magnificent creation. You may not think that you are something that is impressive in any right. But just as that temple was created in such an extravagant way, God is someone, when He creates something, what does He say in the book of Genesis? After that creation story, after He creates the sun and the moon and the animals, the plants, as He sets the laws of this world in motion, what does He say? He says, it is good. And so when God creates something, He says that it is good. And so we should be that reminder of the presence of God, ourselves, with the life that we live, with the choices that we make. As Paul will say again, in 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 16, where he says, "Do you not know that you are God's temple, and that God's Spirit dwells in you?" And so, to know this, that this fact, that we have that, kind of that designation, as the temple of God, that does give us some responsibility. That does give us, a perspective on what we should pursue, in life. But it also reminds us just, who we are and just who we belong to, as people. We don't belong to the things of this world. We don't belong, to the people of this world. But we belong, to God, because we are someone whose life should be something that brings glory to Him, and because a reminder of His goodness, and His, greatness. And so, like he said, it gives us, some responsibility, as well. In Matthew chapter 7 and verses 3 through 6, Jesus gives a warning, to the people concerning hypocrisy, concerning, the act of saying something and then doing something else, of kind of contradicting your own teaching. He gives a warning, against that. And starting in verse 3 of Matthew chapter 7, he says, "Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but do not notice the log in your own eye? Or how can you say to your neighbor, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' while the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your neighbor's eye." This is a warning against this idea of hypocrisy that Jesus gives his people. And so the question that we have and that we have to ask ourselves, if we are the temple of God, if we are that reminder, that if we are something that should glorify God with our time here on this earth, then the question is our temple in order? Is it something that is in the state that it needs to be? Throughout the history of Israel, they did not always keep the temple in order, but rather sometimes they fell away and they worshiped these false idols, these false gods, and sometimes they even brought these idols into the temple itself, in order to worship them. They didn't always keep the temple in order, but it sometimes fell into disarray, even to the point to where they would forget even the law itself, and would push it away, and nobody would know what to do. So we have to do that self-examination, to ask ourselves, Is our temple in order? Do we fall into the same trap that Jesus talks about here in Matthew chapter 7? Are we someone who speaks, good things, but our actions contradict that? We follow, a different path. What is our, where are we as an individual, as a person? How do you stand, with God? Is God does he dictate, your actions or just, your words? Is he someone who is a light, to your path? Or is it something that you just acknowledge from your time to time? Is your temple, in order? We're never going to be, perfect. We're never going to be free of mistakes. We're never going to be someone who is, free from the limitations of humanity and the nature that it holds. But if we're going to be someone who tells the good news to others, if we're going to be someone who is that beacon of hope, that temple, then we need to have that temple in order. We need to have it in a place that even when we do fall away, we can go to God and we can ask for that forgiveness, and so that we can always be on that path that we need to go. In Psalm chapter 32 and verse 2, David here, he wrote this song, and he is someone who was a very passionate person. He's someone who has a very deep sense of his relationship with God. And being musically talented, he was able to communicate that in a very poetic way. But in Psalm chapter 32, in verse 2, he cries out to God for forgiveness and acknowledges the sin that he had. In verse 2 it says, I acknowledged my sin to you, and I did not cover my iniquity. And I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord. And you forgave the iniquity of my sin. He kind of tells the process of forgiveness there, where he says, I acknowledge my sin to you, I confessed my sin to you, and you forgave my sin. And that's a wonderful thing to think about, that we can go to God, that we can give our, talk to him about the things that we have done, confess the things that we have done, and he will forgive. That's, in our world, that's not always something that we see. When you make a mistake in this world, sometimes we're afraid of the repercussions, we're afraid of the consequences. And you may have to deal with consequences of sin. Sometimes it does have those things. But when it comes to our spiritual standing with God, God has forgiveness, he has a willing forgiveness, and he has a forgiveness that is complete, something that is full, something that is more maybe than what mankind would give. But God is someone who does more than mankind could do. And so, is it, in order? Is our temple in order? And the last thing that we will probably ask, concerning this is your temple in need of repair? Is it in need of something that needs to be built back up? Is it in need of repair? In Mark chapter 11 and verse 25, this is what Jesus gives this instruction on praying, and also on this essence of forgiveness, as we noted. And whenever you stand praying, forgive, if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father also who is in heaven may forgive you your trespasses. He says, kind of similar to what we talked about earlier. And when he says that when there is a opportunity to forgive, just as God forgives us, we should be able to pass that on as well. When we come to God in prayer, he says, if you have anything against your brother, settle that. You repair that temple that you have, repair that relationship, so that you can be unhindered in your worship to God. We don't want to have anything standing in between us and God, and us and being able to worship him in the best way possible. In Ephesians chapter 1 and verse 7, Paul he says, in him we have redemption through his blood, a forgiveness of our trespasses according to the riches of his grace. In him we have your redemption. In him we have that salvation that only comes through Jesus. There's a lot of things, like I said, that are impressive, in our world today. Like I said, you can see all those buildings that we talked about. You can see the magnificent structures, the roads that have been built. All those things are pretty impressive. Skyscrapers that reach into the sky. People have done some amazing things. But there is nothing in this world, that can solve, that problem of sin. But only Jesus, you can be the one to take care of that and to wash that away, completely. That's why he went to the cross. That's why he did what he did. And when he came to this earth for only a short time, throughout his ministry, Jesus, was the one who gave us that salvation. And so, as we see, a temple is something that should remind us that God is with us, and that God is here for us, and that we have a responsibility to God. We have a responsibility to Him. And it's not just a one-way relationship, but we do have a responsibility to God as well. But God is with us. He's not going to abandon us and leave us out in the cold, but He's someone who is with us. And people can be a reminder of that. They can be a reminder that He is there for us, that He has forgiveness, and that He is someone who welcomes those who come to Him. Who welcomes them with open arms and with a willingness to bring them back into the fold. That should be a wonderful thing for us. It should be an encouraging thing for us, and should inspire us to go forward. And so the temple of the living God, that's something that's really special. It's something that is really good, and I hope it's something that we can fill up to, that we can fit up to, and that we can encourage as we go along. It's a wonderful thing to know. Thank you.
If you have a Bible question, would like to receive a free Bible correspondence course, would like a copy of free books, please contact the Nettleton Church of Christ. Speaking the Truth in Love is brought to you by these area churches of Christ. Speaking the Truth in Love can be viewed online at nettletonchurchofchrist.org.